A haunting melody fills Baker Street, its final note, a scream. Welcome to Fog Casebook. I am your host, Vela. This community keeps growing. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your comments always make these mysteries sing. A wire reached Baker Street a few minutes before midnight upon a night of that clammy November, which makes a Londoner doubt his bones. Mrs. Hudson, with a face of alarm, brought it up upon a tray with the spirits. Holmes opened it with his long forefinger and thumb as delicately as though it were a butterfly he meant to preserve, read and handed it to me without comment. Orlov dead on stage, foul play suspected, require your immediate presence at St. James's Hall. Lestrade. Orlov? I cried. Nikolai Orlov, the violinist. The same, said Holmes, leaning back so that the fire caught the sharp outline of his profile. A man who made Paganini sound like a parish fiddler, if one believes the critics. Our friend Lestrade is not a devotee of the arts. For him to summon us in such terms suggests that the curtain has fallen upon something more than a bravura cadenza, your boots, Watson. 5 minutes later, we were in a hansom rattling westward, the horse's breath steaming about its muzzle, the lamps reading their way through the drifting mist like cautious eyes. Holmes had sunk into that silence of his which I came to recognize as the ante-room to swift action. I busied myself with the facts I could summon from memory. Orlov had arrived in London a fortnight before and had set society aflutter. He was a small man, swarthy, with a peaked beard and eyes that burned. His instrument, so the papers reported, was an Italian of the highest pedigree, whose voice could be coaxed into the merest whisper, and then, by some devilry of bow and wrist, hurled like a silver spear to the farthest gallery. "It is that whisper I should like to hear," Holmes murmured, as if answering my thoughts. "Pray observe, Watson, how often an artist's advertised peculiarity becomes his epitaph." I had no time to press him, for we were set down before the portico of St. James's Hall. Even at that late hour a cluster of carriages blocked the street, their occupants craning for news. A few ladies, poorly wrapped for such weather, had the pale astonishment of those who have paid to be delighted and are sent home with a tragedy. At the doors, Lestrade's hard, spare figure was instantly visible. He took us in with a brief nod and led the way along a corridor whose walls were plastered with bills advertising the Russian's genius. "He dropped like a shot in the Beethoven," said Lestrade as we walked. "Right at the end of the slow movement, adagio or some such, when he was playing soft as a cat's paw. No struggle. Fellow just went slack and slid from his chair. We've kept everything as was." The great hall lay dim and cavernous, a few gas jets making islands of light atop a sea of shadow. On the stage the music stands still stood, and the conductor's baton rested precisely across his open score, as though reluctant to confess that its rule had ended. Near the centre, a chair lay tipped upon its side, its velvet seat imprinting a dark oval upon the boards. Beside it, strangest of sights, rested a violin upon a folded silk handkerchief, as if some thoughtful hand had spared it the indignity of the floor. "Doctor?" Lestrade looked to me with the business-like respect I had learned to recognize. "I'll have the body shown you directly. He's not been moved more than to the ante-room there." Holmes, meanwhile, strode to the stage with that peculiar lightness which he could at times command. He did not at once examine the violin. Instead, he circled the chair, glanced up to the gas jets, bent to the footlights, and stood for a long moment very still, his head slightly inclined, as if listening to the hush. "What do you hear, Holmes?" I asked, half jest. "A whisper," said he, so low that only I caught it, "but not from a violin, from the air." There is something uncanny in such speeches. They seem like the first feel of lightning on the back of one's hands. Holmes knelt and placed his fingertips lightly upon the floor. He then took out his lens and passed it slowly along the boards around the fallen chair, lingering near the front leg, where a small smudge, no bigger than the nail of my smallest finger, had been ground into the grain. "Rosin?" I suggested. "Very likely," said he. "And yet—" He touched the spot with the barest edge of his handkerchief and held the cloth to the light. "Rosin seldom has so dusky a complexion. Pray keep your medical senses unclouded, Watson. I shall want them." He moved at last to the violin. Even I, who have no ear beyond the average, felt some reverence in its presence, a delicate amber thing, with a bridge like a poised acrobat, and strings that glowed faintly where the light touched them. Holmes did not touch the instrument. He lay his palm against the stage and pressed his cheek nearly to the wood, as if smelling rather than seeing. Then he shifted his attention to the bow, which lay parallel to it. The horsehair was notched, a finger's breadth from the frog, as though it had been singed. Holmes's nostrils flared, once, twice. "Do you perceive an odour, Watson?" I bent close. "There is a faint scent. Bitter, almond, perhaps." "So the sentimental novelists would have it," Holmes returned, and I could feel his keen amusement without seeing his face. "But one must never be content with literary chemistry. Let us see the man." The ante-room was small and panelled, with an oaken table on which Orlov's slight figure had been laid. A cloak, a magnificent thing lined with sable, had been thrown across his lower limbs. His head lay back, the narrow beard a neat wedge upon a chest that had ceased to rise. If there was any distortion, it was of the most delicate kind, a relaxation at the corners of the mouth and a faint glazing of the eyes, as though the owner had turned to listen to some distant and private music. I made my examination with as much thoroughness as circumstance allowed. There were no marks of violence. The nails were clean. The fingertips, however, bore a curious varnished sheen, as if the man had been polishing something sticky. Only the first finger of the left hand, the finger a violinist presses most, showed a minute abrasion near the tip, a sort of freshened callus. The pulse had been gone some half an hour, the temperature of the body standing with the room's chill. I leaned to the lips and was again met by that elusive, bitter trace. "Well, doctor?" Lestrade prompted. "Sudden failure of the heart is possible," I said. But the condition of the lips, the odour, and that small abrasion, these point rather to a poison of rapid action, the precise agent I would not venture to name without tests. "Poison!" Lestrade's sharp eyes gleamed. "But how administered? There was no glass, no refreshments on stage. He never left his chair." Holmes spoke from the doorway. "On the contrary, he left it many times, musically speaking. He ascended and descended with every phrase. Pray remember the company he kept, a conductor, 24 players, and 1,000 pairs of eyes. An excellent place to commit a secret act, because it is the least secret place in London." "I don't follow you," Lestrade said shortly. "That is because you are trying to," Holmes returned. "Stop, and it will overtake you. Tell me, who were the gentlemen most immediately associated with the deceased tonight?" Lestrade consulted a notebook. "Signor Bellini, the conductor, Mr. Hargreaves, the impresario, Miss Lila Vance, soprano, she sang in the first half, left before the symphony, and, Mr. Felix Ward, second violin, leader of the section when Orlov took a bow or two too many." "There was ill feeling?" "There is always ill feeling where a man takes 3 curtain calls and leaves his fellows to pack their own fiddles," Lestrade snorted. "Ward's a steady player with a flat purse. Orlov. Holmes's eyes had their old steel in them. Envy is a motive of small coin, Inspector. Do not be too ready to spend it. Did Orlov's valet attend him? At the hotel. We've sent for him. Excellent. Meanwhile, I shall trouble you to place a constable at the stage door, another in the orchestra room, and a third here. Nothing leaves instrument, case, bow, mute, or rag without passing first under my nose. Watson, your attention once more. Observe this. He had returned to the hall, and I with him. From the violinist's chair he picked up, with infinite gentleness, and only by its silk cord, a small device of ebony and silver, shaped like an open horseshoe. A mute, I said, to soften the tone. To whisper it, Holmes corrected softly. The violin that whispered death, if our friend's telegram is anything to go by. Look closely at its inner surfaces. I did so, and at first perceived nothing. Then, by shifting the angle to the gaslight, I saw that the silver bore a film, no more than the dullest bloom one sees on grapes, broken here and there by the pressure marks of the bridge. You begin to perceive the direction of the draught, said Holmes. There is much we do not yet know, but we know enough to keep our fingers to ourselves. Lestrade, who had hovered with visible impatience, broke in. Mr. Holmes, am I to understand that a trinket meant to make a fiddle quieter has— You are to understand, Inspector, Holmes said with sudden severity, that here is a case at once pitiful and ingenious. Pitiful because it strikes at a man precisely where he lives, through his art. Ingenious because it contrives to make the very means of expression the means of extinction. Who fitted this mute to the bridge? When? And why was the bow hair marked as though by heat? These are questions that point not to a jealous rival only, but to a hand conversant with both music and chemistry. He turned away with that abruptness which signalled an inward conclusion. Secure the hall. Admit no one but the players and those we name. I shall see Orlov's lodgings before the night is older. Come, Watson, there is more to be learned from a man's drawers than from 1,000 witnesses, and I am curious to know who taught Mr. Orlov to keep his violin upon a handkerchief. He smiled thinly. It is a nice habit, and not of his country. As we stepped again into the wet and smoking dark, I confess my heart beat faster than was my custom. For though I had seen death in many forms, there was something peculiarly dreadful in the thought that a few soft bars of Beethoven, whispered into a great hall, could carry with them the hand of murder. Holmes sprang into the hansom as a man might take offence. "St. Aldate's Hotel," he called to the driver. Then to me as we jolted off. "The night air cures many things, Watson, confusion among them. There is a pattern here as delicate as catgut, and nearly as treacherous. If our murderer has tuned it well, we shall need all our wits to hear it break." The cab bore us along pell-mell like a beetle feeling its way through a comb. The gas lamps were big drops in a fogged pane, and the hoofs made a hollow tattoo that set my mind to its own rhythm. Holmes drew a knee to his chest, and, with his chin sunk to the collar of his ulster, stared into the murk as though it were a subject upon the dissecting table. I knew better than to disturb him when his thoughts went to ground. Only once, as the hansom took a sharp corner, did he speak, and then so softly that it might have been addressed to the rain. They taught him to put his violin on a handkerchief, he murmured. Who are they? St. Aldate's Hotel had a decent frontage, and a porter who, roused at so late an hour, bore his indignation like a livery. Lestrade's wire had arrived before us. A frightened underling had the good sense to fetch Orlov's valet, a compact fellow with close-cropped hair and a peasant's cheekbones. He introduced himself as Petrov. The man's eyes trembled between grief and calculation. "This way, gentlemen," said the manager, keys quivering on a ring like a nervous wren. "We have not disturbed anything." The Russian's suite was a handsome pair of rooms looking over the street. Amidst the heavy draperies, the objects of a roving virtuoso had left their eloquent testimony. A folded tailcoat laid across the back of a chair with military exactness, a travelling music stand, a leather dressing case with the fittings of a continental chemist, and upon a side table a violin case of dark Morocco, its brass clasp dulled by much use. Holmes went first to the case and knelt before it as a collector might genuflect to a reliquary. He opened it with a turn of his long fingers and inhaled, not the sentimental way of a man who worships, but the businesslike way of one who expects a result. Within, the velvet was snowed over with the pale dust of rosin. In the lid pockets lay spare strings, a bridge wrapped in tissue, and a flattened tin that once had held pastilles. It now contained, as Holmes discovered with a thumbnail, a folded wisp of silk that had clearly done duty as a polishing rag. He raised it and held it beneath my nose. "The same bitter trace," I said. "Bitter to the romantic," Holmes corrected, and replaced it with exaggerated care. He drew out a small leather purse of the sort violinists use for accessories. From it he took a squat ebony mute, plain without silver. He balanced it on a finger and let it swing like a pendulum. "Mr. Petrov," said he over his shoulder, "did your master ordinarily play with silver-mounted mutes?" The valet frowned. "No, sir. He kept two, both black, one heavy, one light." "And yet tonight we find the lighter instrument capped with a pretty bauble of silver. Where did that silver come from?" Petrov's hands wrung themselves. "I do not know. I put in the case what is there, sir. My master kept his own bow, his own mute, always. He would not allow—" The man broke off and crossed himself abruptly. Holmes allowed that emotion its course and turned to the dressing case. There were the oddities I have often observed in men whose profession is their own bodies, little bottles without labels, a corked phial of collodion for the fingertips, a saucer crusted with the white residue of some evaporated compound, and a phial whose teeth had taken a smear of amber from hardened varnish. He lifted the collodion and held it to the light, then set it down. From a drawer he brought a folded slip of paper, foreign in its scent and thickness. He did not open it under Lestrade's crude regard, but instead touched its edge to his upper lip with as much delicacy as a man tests a wine. It disappeared into his pocket. "All in order?" Lestrade asked, his patience already raw. "Orderly enough to be suspicious," said Holmes. "A bedroom is most when it has nothing to hide, and this has a little too much to show." He tapped the violin case's lining with a fingernail. "See here, Watson." The velvet, where the instrument's waist would lie, showed two shallow runnels pressed into it, not the long indentation of months, but the fresher channels a day or two will make. Near the bridge well a pale bloom dusted the nap, rubbed smooth in two ovals. He leaned very close, lens in hand, and for a long moment said nothing. "Petrov," I put in, "you were with your master at the hall?" "At the rehearsal, sir. Tonight I dressed him, brushed the coat, warmed the hands. He took the violin himself. He forbade me the stage after the bow. He was particular." "Was it his habit to lay the violin upon a handkerchief?" Holmes asked without looking up. "No, sir. Never." "Then who taught him to begin the habit tonight?" The question cracked the air like a whip. Petrov blinked as though struck. "Sir, before the performance, in the artists' room, Mr. Hargreaves spoke with him. The impresario. He told my master the stage boards had been fresh polished for some deputation of sponsors, and that there was grit in the grain. He said, 'For the varnish's sake, maestro, use a cloth beneath just for tonight.' Mr. Orlov laughed, but he is proud of the wood. He asked me for a silk. I took one from my pocket. From your pocket, not from his case? Holmes's tone was suddenly very mild. I keep one for the shoes, Petrov said wretchedly. It was clean, sir. Holmes rose and walked to the window, his hands behind him. His head dropped so that the smoke from the lamps outside made a low halo round his hair. When he turned back, his face had lost its softness. Inspector, you will be good enough to have Mr. Hargreaves at Scotland Yard by 10 in the morning, not an arrest, a conversation. You will also send a man to secure the stage doorkeeper. No one touched that violinist's chair without his seeing it. Mr. Petrov, for your master's sake, you will answer me plainly. Who among the musicians bore him ill will? Sir, all loved his playing, Petrov cried, and then, lower, and many hated him for it. Mr. Ward, the second violin, was most angry. He spoke of the curtain calls and the money. He said London would tire of caprice. Natural spleen, Holmes observed. What of the soprano? Miss Vance? She adored him. He wrote for her arrangements. They had... He stopped, glanced at the manager, and shut his mouth with the click of a snuff-box. Holmes let the silence work. Presently he moved again to the violin purse and turned out. Its contents upon the table, a small spirit level for setting a bridge, 2 pegs, a cake of rosin worn into a crescent, and a tiny screwdriver with an ivory handle. He hefted the rosin and then, abruptly, scraped its face with the blade of his penknife. The dust fell in a neat line. He divided it and touched the tip of his tongue to the smaller portion. "Holmes!" I protested. "The palate is a poor chemical, but it has the merit of speed," he said lightly, and rinsed his mouth at the carafe. "No, if our poison be rosin, we have entered a new country. This is unmixed, yet we have that persistent odour, that bloom upon the silver, that singe along the hair of the bow. 3 witnesses seldom lie in the same direction, unless they have a common tutor." He was at the violin case again, and now, with his lens, he inspected the little pouch from which the mute had been taken. He traced its stitching with a finger, and then, very gently, turned back the leather lip. The light caught for an instant on something finer than a hair, no more than the glimmer one sees when a spider has spun between 2 books. Holmes drew it out on the blade of his knife, a coil of bright wire, almost invisible, broken at one end. "Piano wire?" I ventured. "Finer. The sort used by watchmakers to test escapements. What has a violinist to do with a watchmaker? And why is the purse scratched along the inside, as though something sharp had been forced to fit?" He replaced the fragment and shut the case. Petrov cleared his throat. "Sir, begging pardon, Mr. Orlov had a visit this afternoon from a gentleman who made watches. He called himself Mr. Blaine from Clerkenwell. He brought a gift, a mute of silver to honour my master's art. I placed it on the mantel. My master tried it only once. He did not like the sound. He said it was too white. I saw him return it to the purse. That is all." "Clerkenwell," said Holmes, and the name seemed to please him as a chess player is pleased by a square long brooded upon. "Inspector, a note to Yard. We shall want the list of watchmakers in St. John Street and adjacent courts who have ever supplied theatrical properties. And another to the Hall. Mr. Felix Ward is not to quit the city." Lestrade scribbled furiously. "And the soprano. Miss Vance is to be asked, courteously, why she left before the symphony." Holmes's gaze slid to Petrov. "You will not mention Mr. Blaine to any soul unless I give you leave. If you must speak, say only that we are arranging for your master's transport tomorrow. You will remain where I can find you." He moved to the hearth and, with the toe of his boot, drew a letter from beneath the skirting board where it had been thrust by some hand in haste. He did not open it. He weighed it, turned it, and smiled without mirth. "Watson," said he, "we are on the edge of the web. The silk is new spun, but it clings admirably. A silver mute from a watchmaker, a warning to protect the varnish, a bow hair kissed by heat or caustic, and a whisper that kills. Add to it a second violin with a grievance and an impresario with an eye for varnish. Do you not feel the draught?" "I feel it," I admitted, "but in which direction does it blow?" "Towards St. John Street before dawn," he replied, "and then, if I am not much mistaken, back to a certain corridor in St. James's Hall. Come, we shall allow Inspector Lestrade to marshal his men, and we will go have a word with a locksmith who calls himself a horologist, for murder, my dear fellow, keeps better time than any watch. The morning after that sinister night found us in Clerkenwell, where the fog lay low between the rows of workshops like smoke unwilling to rise. The narrow lanes rattled faintly with the sound of hammers and tiny files, and the air had that sharp, metallic taint peculiar to a district where men make a living from precision. Holmes walked briskly, the collar of his greatcoat turned up, his eyes darting along the shop fronts until he halted before one whose signboard bore the legend E. Blaine, horologist and specialist in fine mechanisms. The shutters were half drawn, yet a line of light showed beneath the door. Inside, the air was thick with oil and brass dust. Watches in all stages of dismemberment gleamed on the counters like open eyes. A frail old man looked up from his bench as we entered. His spectacles magnified his watery eyes into orbs of glass. His fingers were as fine as the gears they handled. "Mr. Blaine?" Holmes asked. The man inclined his head cautiously. "That is my name, sir." Holmes bowed slightly. "I come on behalf of a client who had the honor of receiving from you a most curious trinket, a violin mute of silver, given yesterday to the late Mr. Nikolai Orloff." The effect was instantaneous. The watchmaker's hand, which had been steady as a metronome, trembled, and a spring leapt from his grip like a living thing. He bent swiftly to recover it, but Holmes's gaze had already taken in the change of colour beneath the man's sallow skin. "You have heard the news, then?" Holmes pressed, softly but inexorably. Yes, sir. It is in all the morning papers. A tragedy. Terrible." "Indeed," said Holmes, glancing idly at a ticking regulator on the wall. "The mute you crafted was a delicate piece of work. You must have taken some pains." Yes, of course. The commission was not ordinary. I was approached by a gentleman, well-dressed, foreign accent. He gave precise instructions paid in sovereigns. I thought no harm." "Describe him, if you please." "Tall," said Blaine, his eyes flicking to the door, as though to measure escape. "Dark hair, brushed back, a scar across one knuckle of the right hand. He said he was acting for an artist, a violinist of renown. He brought me the pattern for the mute, asked that it be lined with silver. To soften the vibration, I thought it odd. Silver deadens resonance, but he insisted. I finished it 2 days ago and delivered it myself as he required." "Where did you meet him?" "At the King's Head Tavern off Cowcross Street." Holmes nodded, eyes gleaming. "Did he leave a name?" "None that would be genuine, I fear. He signed the note of instruction, Herr Vogel." Holmes' expression barely changed, but I caught the briefest tightening at the corners of his mouth, the flicker of recognition he never allowed to linger. "Vogel," he repeated. "German for bird, a name that flies away when one reaches for it. Curious, Watson, that a whispering violin should have the assistance of a man who gives himself wings." He turned to the old watchmaker once more. "Mr. Blaine, you are a craftsman. Did you notice anything unusual in the materials given to you?" Blaine frowned. "Only that the inner surface of the silver band had been treated. The gentleman provided it himself, said it was to prevent tarnish, a thin coating, something like varnish, faint odour, sweet almost like almonds. Holmes's eyes blazed with that cold fire of deduction. Almonds, you say, and you applied heat to fix the band? A little, yes, to set the silver in place. Holmes turned sharply to me. You hear, Watson? The heat that singed the bow hair, the odour, the bloom on the silver, all find their parentage here. The varnish was the carrier, the heat its awakening, a most devilish contrivance. He took a step closer to Blaine, whose lips had begun to tremble. One final matter. The man who commissioned this, did he speak with the assurance of knowledge or the blundering of imitation? The watchmaker hesitated. Assurance, sir. He knew precisely how long to leave the mixture before it cooled, and he warned me, "Do not test it," he said, "or your shop will fall silent forever." Holmes's nostrils flared, and I could almost feel the mental leap. Poison vapour, activated by friction or heat, ingeniously wicked. Mr. Blaine, you have been an unwitting accomplice in a murder most refined. Remain at your bench. Scotland Yard will require a statement. Outside the fog had lifted slightly, but the light seemed thinner for it. Holmes set a rapid pace toward the cab rank, his mind visibly alive with calculation. I followed, struggling to keep stride. "You see it now, Watson," he said. "The chain begins to tighten. A silver mute delivered through deceit, its surface brushed with a varnish that releases poison fumes when warmed by vibration. The murderer relied upon the violin's own song to kill its master." "But who could conceive such a plan?" I asked. "And a musician? A chemist? Both?" "Both, perhaps," Holmes replied grimly. "And more, a man who understood vanity. Orlov's pride was his undoing. The same conceit that made him play past exhaustion would make him try a novelty upon the very eve of triumph. The assassin knew his temperament well." The cab bore us swiftly to Baker Street, where Holmes immediately cleared the table of his chemical apparatus. Within minutes he had obtained a small phial from his pocket, the sample of powder from the stage, and was now heating a fragment over a spirit lamp. The odour that rose was faint but unmistakable. Almond and iron mingled with something acrid that made the throat sting. "Prussic acid vapour," he pronounced. "Hydrocyanic, in its most volatile form. Imagine, Watson, the heat of the bow upon the strings, the gentle vibration, all combining to release death in invisible whispers, a man playing his final note and breathing his doom." The horror of it struck me silent. Holmes extinguished the flame, his gaze already distant. The ingenuity bespeaks not passion but intellect. We must ask, who benefits from Orlov's silence? The impresario who profits by scandal, the rival violinist who inherits fame, or the woman who shared his confidences? He crossed to his correspondence shelf and drew forth the letter he had found beneath the skirting board. With his scalpel he slit the edge and spread the sheet beneath the lamp. It was written in a hurried hand, half English, half Russian. Holmes read aloud. "You are in danger. The thing you were given is not what it seems. Do not use it, or it will sing your requiem. Destroy it and leave London before Sunday. L. L, Holmes mused. Lila Vance, perhaps. The soprano warned him. He did not heed it. He handed me the paper. Notice the tremor of the pen, the ink blotted in haste. This was thrust beneath the board. By whom? Someone in fear, yet near enough to act. Miss Vance must have learned of the plot, perhaps through affection, perhaps guilt. Either way, she will tell us more. He rang the bell sharply. Mrs. Hudson, a cab at once. We dine in haste and call upon Miss Lila Vance before the Yard has finished its breakfast. As he gathered his hat and cane, I caught the gleam in his eye, that glacial brightness which meant the chase was now alive in his veins. He turned at the threshold. "The murderer, Watson, plays upon two instruments, the violin and the human heart. Let us see which yields first to our touch." Miss Lila Vance lodged in a modest house off Bedford Place, where the plane trees rattled their bare fingers against the panes, and the bell pull had lost its silk to honest use. She received us at once, for the maid had scarcely gone up with our cards before a voice, low, warm, and hurried, called for us to be shown. The singer stood in the doorway of her sitting-room with one hand upon the lintel, as though to steady herself. She had that peculiar pallor which is the privilege of the stage and of the sick-room. In her it suggested vigils rather than rouge. A cloak lay over a chair where I fancy it had been thrown the night before, and never since moved. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "I knew you must come. I prayed it." Holmes inclined his head with a gravity very near to kindness. "It is seldom that prayer shortens my journeys, Miss Vance, but today it has. You warned Mr. Orloff." She flinched. "He is dead, then? I dared to hope—" "Dead," said Holmes plainly. "And the ink of your warning was not yet dry when he took the stage. Will you tell us why you left the hall before the symphony?" Her eyes filled and steadied. "Because I thought I could do more from a distance than by screaming in the wings like a fool. Please, come in." We took the chairs she indicated. The room was neat to severity. A scored pianoforte stood open with Mendelssohn upon the stand, and upon the mantel a single card, creased where it had been clutched, lay beside a small silver vinaigrette. She saw Holmes glance and took up the card with a little shudder. "That brought me to the artist's door yesterday at 5. It is from Mr. Hargreaves." Holmes read, "A private rehearsal is requested for patrons. Kindly attend at 5 o'clock and wait in the green room until called. H." "You went?" Holmes asked. "I did, but there was no rehearsal. The stage was dark. I waited in the little anteroom beyond the corridor, where the old wardrobe stands. The door was not quite latched. I could hear voices in the corridor." "Whose?" "One was Mr. Hargreaves. The other spoke low and careful, in that way foreigners do when they have too much English. I did not recognize it. They were discussing a gift for Nikolai, Mr. Orloff, something to soften the tone. Mr. Hargreaves said the hall boards had been polished, and he would tell Petrov to use a cloth, that it would save the Cremona from a scratch. The other man said, 'The varnish will carry if he is vain enough to use it.'" "The varnish," Holmes repeated softly. "You heard those words?" "I did. I pushed the door a little, just enough to see Mr. Hargreaves's back, and the hand of the other gentleman upon the jamb. There was a scar across the knuckle." Her eyes darted to Holmes. He made no sign beyond the faintest assent. When they saw Mr. Bellini coming along the passage, the gentleman drew away. Mr. Hargreaves turned as if to call him, and I pulled the door to. A minute later, Mr. Hargreaves came in to me, all smiles, and begged me to forgive the change. The rehearsal was deferred. He spoke so airily that I doubted my senses. "Why did you not go to Mr. Orloff at once?" She looked down at her hands, which were slim and vigorous, the hands of a woman who has laboured to make her gifts obedient. One palm bore a faint reddening, as if from some sharp pressure. "I did," she said. "I found him in the artist's room an hour later, preening as always, polishing the violin with a silk. There was a little purse on the table with a new mute in it. Silver. He fitted it and played a bar." The tone grew thin and strange. He laughed and said it was white air, and he would not use it. He put it back. I told him I thought he was in danger. He shrugged. "Ah, Lila, danger and applause come in the same bouquet," he said. He kissed my hand and went out to smoke. I wrote the note then in his room and thrust it under the skirting in my panic, because Mr. Hargreaves came in rudely, and I could not be found there without question. You left before the symphony, I said. Because you feared to watch. Because I meant to fetch a cab and go to the hotel to see Petrov, she answered swiftly. If Nikolai would not heed me, perhaps his valet would keep him from any novelty, but at the stage door I found Mr. Felix Ward, flushed and angry, speaking to the doorkeeper. He laughed when I passed. "Run along, Miss Nightingale," he said. "Your Russian nightingale will sing without you." I could not bear his coarseness. I went home and sent a message to Petrov. She pressed her lips. They brought it back to me this morning, with the black edge of the news. Holmes had listened with that stillness of his, which is a kind of pressure upon the air. He now rose and, with permission in his eyes, if not upon his lips, took up the vinaigrette and sniffed it lightly. "Not almonds," he remarked, "merely lavender. Pray forgive me. One must be certain where scents begin and end." He set it down and moved to the mantel card once more, placing it precisely as he had found it. "Miss Vance, you speak of Mr. Ward's coarseness. Has there been more than words between the gentlemen?" She hesitated, then lifted her chin. Mr. Ward detested Nikolai's liberties. He said the orchestra were tradesmen hired to set jewels for a mountebank. He also... She coloured in a way that did her credit. He suggested that I encouraged Nikolai's conceit. It is true I admired his playing. It is also true that admiration is not license. I have had to say so. Holmes nodded, as if annotating a margin. "You have assisted me admirably. One detail more, and I have done. When you glimpsed the stranger's hand in the corridor, did you see any ornament? A ring, perhaps?" "A signet," she said at once. "Oval. The stone was dark. There was a bird upon it, I think. I cannot swear." He drew a long breath, and for a moment the cold light leapt in his eyes. "Thank you. You have coughed the dust from a very old track, and it glitters. You must now do precisely as I say." "I will," she said. "You will go this morning to Mr. Hargreaves and ask for your fee. Say no more than this, that your head aches when you are near new polish. Do not mention mutes, silver, or warnings. If he is innocent, he will laugh. If guilty, he will watch you. Above all, you will attend tonight's meeting at the hall when the committee determines the memorial concert. You will sing, if asked. You will not be alone in any corridor." Her lips parted. "Is that wise?" "It is necessary," Holmes returned. "Our adversary has composed a very pretty piece in 3 movements: the commission, the preparation, the performance. He is now writing a 4th, the coda in which a witness is silenced or a loose end clipped. We must be present at the first bar." When we had taken our leave and regained the street, the winter sun had lifted a hand's breadth and made a virtue of the smoke. Holmes set off northward at such a pace that I was forced to remonstrate. "You are hard upon your boots this morning." "I shall be harder on another's before night," he said. "Come, there are 2 visits to make before we allow Lestrade the pleasure of action. The second violin? In due course. First the doorkeeper. A hinge, Watson, that admits a great many doors. A bribe leaves a crease in a man's pocket, a conspiracy, a crease in his memory. If Miss Vance's note was to reach Petrov, someone stood to prevent it. The stage door at St. James's Hall was guarded by a face like the rind of a Dutch cheese. The man blinked at our cards, grew respectful at the names, and sour at the questions. Holmes's tone, which can be as gentle as a violin when it suits him, hardened to the rasp of a file. In 5 minutes, the rind split. "A gentleman dropped half a sovereign to see Mr. Orlov's room while the rehearsal broke," the fellow confessed at last. "Said he'd left his cane there the night previous. Tall, foreign, ring on his finger, sign of some bird. I thought no harm, sir. He went in and out in a trice, and I swear he never touched the fiddle." Touch is not always necessary, Holmes observed and looked at the floor. The boards near the threshold bore a smear no broader than a bootlace, dark where many feet had rubbed it thin. He crouched, touched it with his handkerchief and held it to his nose. "Camphor to dull the almonds," he said, almost to himself. "A considerate precaution for a man who must move in close quarters." We left the man to his fear and went round to the orchestra room, where Mr. Felix Ward was coiling his strings with a violence that would have sawn them in two had they any feelings to hurt. He was a hard-boned fellow with a jaw like a clamp and a pair of eyes that never quite met one's own. He did not rise. "You are Mr. Ward," said Holmes in his driest register. "My name is Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. A few questions." "If it's about the foreign peacock," Ward said, "I've answered them all." "Peacocks are innocent birds," Holmes returned. "It is the men who wear them we must watch. You left the stage door at 8:30 last night, and you laughed at Miss Vance." "Why?" Ward's mouth thinned. "She is a fine singer and soft-headed about fellows who bow. And you are a sober player and hard-headed about fellows who take your limelight." His jaw shifted. He said nothing. "Did you see the impresario in the corridor yesterday at 5? Ward's eyes flicked. "Hargreaves? He is always in corridors." "And a foreign gentleman with a ring who smells faintly of camphor." "I smell rosin," Ward snapped. "If there was camphor, it was in your fancy." Holmes looked at him a long moment, not unkindly, as a chess player looks at a piece he will not move just yet. "You play second where you might, in a just world, have played first," he said quietly. "Pray be very careful whom you follow in this matter, Mr. Ward. Some leaders conduct their friends into the dock." He turned upon his heel, and we were in the corridor again, where the hall's chill made the gaslight flutter like shamed candles. I could contain myself no longer. "You believe Hargreaves complicit?" "I believe he was conductor to the overture," Holmes said, "but there is a hand behind the baton, and it wears a bird upon its signet. Our Herr Vogel has flown once already. It remains to clip his wings. Tonight, Watson, we shall provide him a perch and a bell about his foot." The remainder of that day, Holmes wore his energy close to the skin, like a wire humming within a sleeve. He sent a note to Lestrade to lay hands, lightly, upon Hargreaves and to keep Blaine under a discreet eye, another to the hall steward for the exact hour of the committee's gathering, and a third, by way of a messenger who knew not his master, to Miss Vance with a single line: "Keep to the light, avoid solitude, trust your cue." Then he vanished into his bedroom and emerged, not 20 minutes later, in the nondescript suit and muffler of a man who has never been noticed in his life. I have seldom seen him so content. We were in the vicinity of St. James's Hall while the gasmen were trimming the jets for evening. Holmes conducted me round a side passage where the plaster was still damp from recent repair. "A stage is a city reduced to corridors," he murmured, "and murderers love cities." From his pocket he produced a small tin of pale gum and a square of thin wax. With the quiet precision of a burglar, he pressed the wax into the recess behind the latch of a door leading to the little anteroom Miss Vance had described, the one with the old wardrobe. Over the wax he laid the faintest skim of gum and a dusting of lamp black from the chimney of a stage lantern. "If our friend with the bird ring opens this in a hurry tonight," he said, "we shall keep his heraldry without troubling his permission." The committee gathered at 7, patrons, a sprinkling of musicians and such press as had already elevated Orlov's demise into copy. Hargreaves arrived with a pallor that nature had not intended for him. He greeted all with that moist warmth by which impresarios collect subscriptions. Ward came late, his jaw set, his eyes red-rimmed, as though from too much smoke or too little sleep. Miss Vance entered quietly and took a seat near the front, a strip of white at her throat the only concession to effect. Holmes had drifted from my side as smoke drifts. When next I looked, I could not have said where he was. The hall's chairman opened with condolences and practicalities, the raising of a fund, the appropriateness of a memorial concert, the delicate question of replacing engagements already sold upon Orlov's name. Hargreaves spoke with feeling. If he felt any other sensation, he masked it beautifully. "It is our duty," he declared, "to honor the great artist and shield the public from idle speculation. The press would make a sensation of our misfortune. Let us meet it with dignity." A low murmur of approval met this. Yet beneath the phrases the currents ran. I saw Ward's hand tighten upon the edge of his chair when Hargreaves spoke of the orchestra's gratitude. I caught the chairman's glance slide only once to a spare, silvered object upon the table, covered with a napkin. It was too small for a goblet, too heavy for a mere paperweight. It set my heart to an uncomfortable rhythm. During a lull, I felt a touch at my elbow. Holmes stood beside me with his eyes alight. "The bait is swallowed, Watson. Now we shall feel the line twitch." "What bait?" "Patience." He nodded toward a side door, the very door he had primed. "In 5 minutes, Miss Vance will contrive to knead her shawl from the wardrobe room. I shall see who offers his arm." Events moved almost to his word. The chairman proposed an interval before a vote. Miss Vance rose, excused herself softly, and slipped into the corridor. Hargreaves, who had been detained by a patron's condolences, cut loose as soon as politeness allowed, and made as if to follow. Ward, at the rear, made the same motion a heartbeat later. It was a delicate race, yet the man with practice in reading a room will always catch the first step, and the impresario had made a profession of such reading. He reached the corridor and was gone. Holmes melted after him. I had barely time to gain my feet when the corridor gave a short, stifled cry, the sort that breaks off as if ashamed of itself. I was at the door in 3 strides, my hand outstretched. Before my fingers touched the latch, it jerked inward, and Hargreaves stood upon the threshold with his face framed in the lamplight and his smile arranged with almost cruel neatness. "Doctor, Miss Vance felt faint, that is all. The heat, she will be— Ah, here she is." She emerged behind him, composed but drained. A faint bruise was darkening upon the soft of her forearm, where a strong hand might have steadied or detained. Her eyes met mine for a fraction. There was a question in them. There was also resolve. Holmes appeared from the shadow of the opposite jamb, wholly the well-meaning stranger in shabby cloth. He touched his hat, allowed Hargreaves to pass, and fell in behind like any man who has no call to be near important conversation. When the pair had rejoined the crowd, he caught my sleeve and drew me back into the little room. The latch, when he shut it, left a minute dusty crescent upon his fingers. He smiled and displayed them like a conjurer. "Lampblack, our bird has pecked." He lifted the latch plate with his knife. Within lay the thin wax he had planted. Upon it, sunk as true as a seal in hot wax, sat the oval impression of a signet ring, a bird in profile with a sprig in its beak. "Excellent," he said gently. "We shall ask Blaine later whether his patron bore taste in heraldry as well as in poison." We were not yet done with the evening's music. The chairman had regained the floor and was calling for opinions as to whether a demonstration might lay to rest the idle rumor that some foreign device had contributed to Orlov's end. At this, a reporter, sensing flawed prey, urged that the audience deserved, in the name of truth, a clear denial. Hargreaves smiled his warmest. Let us denounce slander with the instrument itself, he said. Here, and with a flourish he raised the napkin to reveal upon a black velvet square a gleaming silver horseshoe. This trinket was found among our late friend's effects. It is a mute, no more. I will prove how harmless. I rose half out of my seat. Holmes's hand upon my arm pressed me down like a strap. Not yet, he breathed. Hargreaves took up the mute by its silk and, to my horror, made for a violin case that sat upon a side table, Orlov's own, brought in for tribute. Holmes's grasp tightened to pain. "Count with me," he said, in the tone of one instructing a novice in surgery. 1, he will not put it on. 2, if he puts it on, he will not play. 3, if he plays, he will not breathe it. At 1, Hargreaves paused, frowning at the bridge, as a man frowns at a knot. At 2, he placed the mute upon the silk and laughed, flipping the napkin back over it with exaggerated care. "On second thought," he said, spreading his hands, "let us not make a circus. Mr. Ward, perhaps you will oblige with a phrase from Beethoven without childish ornament." Ward, stung by the sneer and eager for occasion, came forward, took the violin with a careful bow, more respectful than I had expected, and played 4 bars, the notes falling like quiet rain. The hall breathed again. A little claque applauded. Hargreaves basked in borrowed calm. Holmes's lips brushed my ear. Our impresario knows exactly what he offered, and exactly why he withdrew it. He is guilt's better actor. But observe Ward's eyes. He saw something not in his part. Indeed, as Ward handed back the violin, his gaze flicked, not to the audience, not to Hargreaves, but to the napkined square, as a dog glances at a meat shelf from which it has once been beaten. He returned to his seat, rigid with some inner argument. The interval ended. Motions were made. Votes taken. Funds pledged. The memorial concert was set for Saturday. When the assembly broke, Holmes was already at the side door. He stooped. The faintest trail, like the shadow of a smudge, led away upon the boards, the kind a cautious boot will make when it has trodden a trace of powder. He followed it with the cold patience of a cat upon a hedge to a passage that fell away toward the musician's entrance. At the bend, a sudden figure loomed, a porter clutching his cap in both hands. "Beg pardon, sir," he mumbled to Holmes's unremarkable coat. "The gentleman as was asking for the wardrobe. He give me this to take to the lady if she fainted again. Said it was vinegar for her nerves." Holmes took the small bottle, unstopped it, and let the faintest thread of vapour reach his nose. He stoppered it at once and pocketed it. "Not vinegar," he said. "Chloroform, with camphor to flatter the conscience. Our Herr Vogel grows clumsy when pressed." We rejoined Miss Vance at the front. Holmes bowed as gravely as if we had paid a polite call. "You have a steadier nerve than many soldiers, madam," he said. "Did he grasp your arm?" She nodded, the bruise now a pale coin under the skin. "He asked if I would rest a moment in the quiet. I said I preferred the light." "And you were right," Holmes said. "But you shall not keep watch alone. Inspector Lestrade will take his turn. Watson and I have business with a watchmaker's wax and a signet ring. Tonight we have taught our bird that the seed is scattered in the open. Tomorrow we shall show him the cage." He spoke low, but I saw that new brightness set in his face, the light that accompanies not merely pursuit, but the moment the quarry first feels the shadow that is following. The wires were tightening. I could almost hear, beneath the murmur of departing voices, that faint metallic sing that tells a trap is near to spring. We returned to Baker Street by a circuit which took in the yard where Lestrade received our tidings with an eagerness that did him credit and a caution that did not. Holmes placed the waxed latch plate upon the inspector's desk as a surgeon lays down a specimen. "You will have that photographed and locked," he said. "No zealous constable is to clean it with his sleeve. Also, the silver mute upon the velvet is to remain where it lies until I say otherwise. If any gentleman in a bird ring demands it for the sake of art, you will be so obliging as to demand his hand." Lestrade's eyes narrowed with pleasure. "We've our eye on Hargreaves, never fear." "Keep it just upon him," Holmes returned, "for the conductor is not the composer. There is a hand that writes beneath his, and it is foreign." By the time a frugal supper had been dispatched, Holmes had already taken a mould from the signet's impression, using a sliver of dentist's wax from his private drawer, and the little japanned box of powders he kept for such uses. He turned the cooled wafer between finger and thumb beneath the lamp. "Observe, Watson, the bird's head is canted, the beak carries a sprig, olive, by the shape, and the wing is cut with 3 feathers only. English work would give us 5 and a fussier scroll. The cartouche is not shield-shaped, but oval, with a chamfer at the base. Continental, German, or Bohemian, but not academic. The hand is that of a practical cutter who makes seals for men who require privacy rather than pedigree." "You propose Hatton Garden?" "In the morning. Meanwhile, we shall invite a canary to sing. A notice will appear in the evening editions, anonymous, but legible to any guilty conscience, that the violin and certain metallic appendages have been transferred to Scotland Yard for scientific examination. It is time our Vogel learned that London cages its birds." He dispatched Billy to the Argus office with the paragraph, and had scarcely lighted his pipe when a sharp rap sounded below. Lestrade's tread mounted brisk, and he entered with that grim relish which the honest policeman feels when the play grows interesting. "We've had a squeak already, Mr. Holmes. Blaine, the watchmaker. Someone has been at him. Neighbours found him insensible on his shop floor not half an hour ago. Door locked, back window prized. Our man's at the infirmary. They sent for me because of the foreign bottle on his bench." Holmes had his coat on before the inspector had done speaking. "Come, Watson, if our murderer writes a second movement, I would hear it before the rests." Clerkenwell had the exhausted look of districts that work by daylight and sleep by thrift. Blaine's shop showed a spill of lamplight under its door. Within, a constable stood uncertainly among the gaping watches. The old man lay upon a truckle hastily dragged from the back room. Colour crept back to his cheeks with every breath of plain air that a kindly neighbour wafted with a newspaper. Holmes waved aside officious sympathy and went to the bench. He did not touch, his eyes touched for him. "Chloroform again, with its friend the camphor," he said softly, angling the bottle so the lamplight threw a crescent along its meniscus. "Cruder this time, and hurried. The lock?" he asked. "Untouched," Lestrade answered. "The back shutter has the marks of a jemmy and the sills smeared with something greasy. Oil from a clockman's kit, taken up on a boot. The visitor came by the alley, found our old friend at his bench, and dosed him rather than argue. What did he seek?" On the bench, between the clutter of mainsprings and cups, lay the shallow tray in which Blaine had worked silver. The little rests of solder still lay in a neat fan. Beside them a strip of thin leaf, bright as moon water where it had been newly torn away. Holmes's glance skimmed them and halted upon an empty rectangle the size of a playing card, a space kept by habit for some small thing that now was not. "The pattern," he murmured. "Or the second mute." "Second?" I exclaimed. He pointed with his pipe stem. "Blaine told us he made one. But craftsmen of his age and tribe always make 2. One as ordered, one to prove that the first was no fluke. Our visitor, having smelled the yard in the evening paper, comes to tidy his work, removes the spare, and while he is about it, whatever sketch or note he had imprudently left, but haste is a critic. See here." He indicated the floor behind the bench. In the dust that settles where fine filing is a way of life, a pair of prints had written themselves clearly and then blurred at the edges where the assailant had trodden his own traces. One was the square-toed, low-heeled boot I had come to associate with the continental fashion. The other was overlaid by a faint chevron of patterning, as if the heel had been briefly capped with something ribbed. Holmes crouched, lifted the edge of the mat, and brought up a trifle that seemed at first glance no more than a thread. Under the lamp it proved a sliver of silk twisted upon itself, green darkening to black where oil had stroked it. "A cord from a mute," he said, torn in the hurry. He pocketed the replica, but his fingers remembered the first. Blaine stirred and opened his watery eyes. Fear, recognition, and relief chased one another across them in short succession. "He came with a handkerchief," he whispered. "I smelled a sweetness. Then the floor moved." "You will not smell sweetness again tonight," Holmes told him gently. "Who, Mr. Blaine?" "A foreigner. The knuckle." His own hand twitched, marking the scar across a right hand. He said he had to correct an error. He took what he'd brought and what he'd told me to keep. He asked if any had called upon me. I said, only you. He looked at your card and smiled without teeth. Holmes's nostrils lifted. Teeth or no, he will find it less easy to smile tomorrow. Rest, sir. The worst has passed. He rose. Lestrade, station a man here who can keep his eyes open without moving his hands. If our friend returns for anything further, I would not have him greeted by an enthusiasm that breaks clues. Out in the alley, the fog made a private world of brick and damp. Holmes paused under the rusty iron of a fire escape and tipped his face to the gloom as if there were stars to read. "We are near the heart of it now. Our Vogel has two appetites, to remove what may speak and to preen before those who know art. He attempted the one tonight and will essay the other tomorrow." "The memorial meeting?" I ventured. "The rehearsal for it," he returned. "There will be a rehearsal, be assured. Men like Hargreaves call in favours as a conjurer calls for silence. And our murderer will need to be present, if only to ensure that the silver trinket, which the Yard so obligingly possesses, does not by mishap return to a bridge. Tomorrow we shall bring violins, but not to play them. We were early at Hatton Garden, where jewellers keep a city within a city, and the commerce of glitter is conducted with the morality of ledgers. A certain Mr. Cone, whom Holmes had once served in a matter of missing brilliance, examined the wax with that reverence tradesmen pay to good work. "German?" he said at last, peering through a lens fitted to his eye, as a man fits a conscience. "Not new. The cut shows an older tool, hand-graver, not machine. You see how the feather is a single stroke with a lift at the end. Bohemia. Prague, perhaps. I have a cousin who knows a man who knows a bench there. The oval cartouche? Yes. And this chamfer? Practical work, as you say. For a club or a society where prettiness is vanity. A society with a bird in its escutcheon," Holmes mused. "An Orpheon? A league of musicians?" Cone shrugged. "In Vienna there is the Schwalbe, the swallow, a conviviality for men who sing and drink. In Prague, something similar but with stricter dues. In London," he added, with an expressive twist of the lips, "there is nothing so honest." When we emerged into the street, Holmes's mouth had the hard line that meant his mind had stopped considering and begun to arrange. "Schwalbe will do as well as Vogel," he said. "Our man shelters beneath a foreign club where no English eye thinks to look. Hargreaves supplies corridors and patrons. The club supplies chemistry and courage. Put them together and you have a bird with English seed and a continental song. By afternoon, The hall was alive again, under gas and bustle. I have often remarked upon the difference between a place prepared for an audience and the same place practicing its illusions. Without faces to flatter it, a stage grows candid. Hargreaves, candid or not, swept about like a man paying his own compliments. Ward tuned with a studied indifference that deceived none but himself. Miss Vance nodded to us and kept close to two older ladies who chirped about programmes and wreaths. Lestrade, in plain coat, sat in the stalls like a citizen whose purse had been stolen and who intends to enjoy the concert notwithstanding. Holmes, who had come armed not with a violin but with a length of fine wire, a compass, and a brown paper parcel, placed himself at the wings. He selected a chair of the same make as Orlov's and measured, with that absorbed air which seems to render him invisible, the distance from its front leg to the lip of the stage, from the bridge rest to the footlight, from the door latch to the corner where the wardrobe cast its shadow. He spoke scarcely above breath, yet I caught the words. "The same hand loves the same distances," he said. "If he comes, he will place his instruments where his muscles remember them. We shall set ours an inch nearer to the light." "And the parcel?" I asked. "A toy," he said, and the chill glitter came into his eyes. "If he means to demonstrate again, we shall allow him to do so under conditions of our composing. A violin that whispers death may yet be persuaded to sing confession." He touched my sleeve. "You will keep beside Miss Vance. If any man proposes to mend her headache, you will be the physician present. Lestrade will watch the silver. I will watch the bird." Rehearsal began, as rehearsals always do, in a clatter of chairs, in the fretful nibbling of strings, in the conductor's polite tyranny over men who would rather talk. Yet beneath the commonplace I felt the tautness of a wire drawn to the breaking point. Holmes had placed himself a little upstage of the wings, where the catwalk's shadows fell across his cheekbones. To any but me, he was a stage hand of no importance, fiddling with a length of cord. Lestrade occupied the third row, centre, with the stolidity of a man who has paid for his seat and refuses to be moved by art or argument. Miss Vance kept to the lit places like a ship hugging a safe coastline. I put myself between her and every corridor that promised quiet. Hargreaves lifted his hand and brought the players in upon a soft chord, then cut them with a graceful flick. "Once again from letter C," he cooed, "without dragging, gentlemen, without self-pity. The public will supply that." Ward rolled his jaw and set the bow. His section followed with the resentful exactitude of men being right for the wrong reasons. At the end of the phrase, the impresario made a little show of consulting his watch, the better to glance at the side table where, under a modest napkin, the silver mute lay upon its velvet like a clever sin. I saw Ward's eyes return to it as a dog's eyes will return to the dish that is not his. Across the pit, a lean man in a dark overcoat, unknown to me, sat with his hat upon his knees, cap pulled low, his features arranged in that blank attention which is itself a veil. He might have been a minor patron, a critic's jackal, or some man from the chairman's committee. Yet I thought I recognized the curious way he held his right hand, a kind of unconscious economy, as if certain knuckles remembered an old injury and would not flex without cause. Holmes had remarked that murder writes in distances. Now he moved an inch nearer to the chair he had measured earlier, and with a touch so light it would not have troubled the dust upon a moth's wing, he adjusted its front leg the breadth of a sixpence. "Mr. Ward," Hargreaves called, "oblige us with the Beethoven transition as last night, unadorned." There was a titter at unadorned. The orchestra knows where sarcasm keeps its gloves. Ward obeyed, and the notes fell. Hargreaves made a show of tired patience. then lifted the napkin with a little flourish no audience could resist. "We have had enough of superstition," he said lightly. "Let us prove a mute is a mute and a rumour is nothing." Holmes, hand on the rope, tightened, though it was only a coil about his fingers. The impresario took the silver by its silk and stepped toward the violin that lay open in its case upon the side table, the Orloff instrument, I knew, by the bloom along its ribs and the varnish that seemed to glow from within. At the last second he checked himself, laughed, and set the mute down again as one might set down a scorpion, to show how fearless one is by the act of not touching. "Another time," he murmured. "We cannot work ourselves into hysteria, Mr. Ward." "Play it," Ward said, not loudly and not for the room, but for the one man whose opinion had never yet needed him. Hargreaves did not so much as blink in the player's direction. The lean man in the dark coat had not moved. Only Holmes moved, and he no more than a hand's breadth, turning his head to take in at once the side table, the stranger's profile, and the corridor that ran toward the wardrobe room. The rehearsal stumbled and then settled into its circular business. When Hargreaves called a pause, musicians drifted toward cigarettes and doors, and the side table lay briefly unobserved by all save three. Lestrade rose, looked at his glove, and sat again as if to remind himself that patience is sometimes an act. I felt Miss Vance's sleeve brush mine. She had the poise of a woman who means to rise and not faint. Holmes's eyes were no longer cold. They had the bright, dry glitter which meant the next note was already on his tongue. It came from the corridor, a breath more than a sound, the quick intake that a man cannot help when he has seen his prize unguarded. The lean fellow was on his feet without hurry. He did not go to the side table like a thief. He went like a servant in his own house, passing behind a bassoonist, and a double bass with the easy skill of one who has threaded instruments all his life. His right hand, scarred across the knuckle, as Miss Vance had said, hovered, settled, and in the same motion slipped the silver into the baggy pocket of his overcoat. Holmes was already moving, yet his movement had nothing of the constable's pounce. He took 2 steps, stooped, as if for a dropped pencil, and with that stoop brought the brown paper parcel from beneath the table and slid it into place. He straightened, brushed the dust from his cuff, and spoke for me alone. "Now we have him, but let him think he has us." The stranger did not quit the hall. He circled to the wings as any man might who wished to speak to the impresario, without parade. Holmes arrived at the same aperture at the same instant, and the 2 men paused, hat to hat, each making way with exactly that degree of civility which contains a refusal. They would have passed, but Holmes, with an air of absent-minded kindness, produced from his pocket a small handkerchief and held it out. "You have touched the resin," he said, in the tones of an underling who fears the master will soil his coat. "It marks gentlemen's sleeves." The man, surprised into a habit he had likely practised all his life, extended his right hand a trifle. Holmes, as if grateful, dabbed it. "You will say there is nothing in this." Yet when the man went by, his fingers bore the faintest moisture. I, who have seen Holmes whiten a man's cuff with plaster, or blacken a latch with smoke for the sake of a trace, knew that the cloth he had used was not innocent. "Silver nitrate," he whispered, when he had returned to me. "No stain now, but in an hour, with light, black as confession. If he has companions, they will know him by the honourable mark upon his fingers." Hargreaves called the men back and flung them once more upon the rocks of the adagio. The stranger remained in the wing shadow long enough to reassure himself that the silver was gone and his pocket heavy. Then he drifted toward the musician's entrance. Lestrade, whose patience had an eye in it, rose quietly and went not after him, but to the door the man must use if he wished to vanish. Holmes held me a moment with 2 fingers. "We will not take him in the corridor," he said. "If he is alone, we scare him into flight. If he is not, we drive him into another hand. We shall give him rope. Let him tie the knot." At that instant, Miss Vance made the smallest sound, a catching of the breath that might have been nothing had I not felt the tremor run through her sleeve. A man had stepped suddenly from a side door that led to the wardrobe room, the same threshold upon which Holmes had earlier kept the ring's mark, and touched her elbow with the gravity of solicitude. It was Hargreaves. "You look pale, my dear," he said in a tone of ruthless paternal feeling. "Come, the air by the wardrobe is cooler. 2 moments only. We cannot afford illness." He had chosen his words well. Any refusal would have looked temper, not prudence. Yet his hand held her with an insistence that no solicitude requires. I moved with them at once. Hargreaves stopped, smiled his practised smile, and half-turned, so that his back barred the doorway. "Doctor," he said urbanely, "I must consult with Miss Vance upon programme order. You will excuse—" Holmes's voice came from behind me, quiet as a cough. "One touches with the left hand when one means comfort, Mr. Hargreaves. The right is for business." Hargreaves' eyes flicked to him, flicked down, and returned. There was no change in his expression, but he released Miss Vance's arm. On his right hand, where the flesh is tender along the web of the thumb, a faint shadow had begun that was not dirt and not ink. He glanced instinctively at his fingers, and I saw the quick, double thought, the first that told him to rub, the second that told him not to show he had seen. Holmes smiled without mirth. "Sunlight is unpleasant in our island," he remarked. "It blackens everything that would be white." Hargreaves's lips barely moved. "You will make yourself ridiculous, Mr. Holmes, with your tricks and stains." "Possibly," Holmes returned. "It is a risk I share with impresarios." There was movement in the corridor beyond him. The lean man in the dark coat, now without his hat, his eyes measuring the distance to the door and to Hargreaves with the speed of a predator testing a fence. Holmes stepped neatly aside to give him the freedom that men take only when they think it granted. The fellow passed. The daylight from the stage door fell upon his right hand. The fingers darkened as if some slow bruise rose to meet the sun. He saw it, swore in a guttural whisper, and jerked his hand inside his coat. Lestrade appeared then, late by a bar and a half, which is the Yard's custom when it means to be early, later. The inspector's glance swept from Hargreaves's hand to the stranger's pocket, to the side table where the brown paper parcel now lay, in the place the silver had occupied. "Mr. Holmes," he said, in a tone that was almost cheerful, "am I to understand we have exchanged one toy for another?" "You are to understand," Holmes said, "that if Mr. Hargreaves, or his friend, wishes to demonstrate the harmless nature of a certain trinket, he may do so upon that which we have provided. It has the merit of resembling the original, and the virtue of being incapable of harm." The lean man made for the door. Lestrade lifted a palm no higher than a conductor checking a crescendo. "If you please," he said mildly. "A word at the Yard, sir." "For what?" the man demanded, his English clipped fine. "For your hand," said Lestrade, with a gloom that had a touch of relish in it. "It has something to say." The fellow's gaze slid again to Hargreaves, who did not meet it, and then quite suddenly to Miss Vance. There was hatred in that glance, not of her, but of any witness whose eyes had not been bought. He took a breath as if for violence. Holmes's sleeve barely brushed mine. "Not here," he murmured. "He's not a knife. He's a mechanism. Mechanisms fail when they must perform too many functions. He will choose flight." "He did, With a turn so swift it made the double bass quiver in its stand, the man darted for a side stair that led toward the scene docks. Lestrade swore and gave chase. Two constables rose from nowhere like footmen from a bureau. Holmes did not run. He walked to the brown paper parcel, untied the string, and removed the cloth within. It was a mute of silver, mute in every visible respect save one. Within, where the first bore its thin, treacherous varnish, this one was lined with a film of plaster and charcoal, an absorbent that would eat any vapour and ask for more. He set it on the bridge of Orlov's violin, drew a bow once across the strings, and in that whisper that had heralded death the day before, there was nothing but a sigh like a child's. Hargreaves had watched, outwardly unmoved. Now his jaw worked once, twice, as if it had found gristle in rhetoric. Holmes looked up at him with the air of a man who has reached the end of a paragraph and is curious how the next will begin. "Shall we take the coda at your tempo, Mr. Hargreaves?" he asked. "Or would you prefer to wait upon your first violin?" Lestrade's men clattered down the stair like a burst of sticks. The hall, which a moment before had been a hive of petty vanities, stood suddenly still, as hives do when smoke appears. Hargreaves' lips moved upon some speech he had been nursing, then shut again when he saw that Holmes had not troubled to hear it. My friend's gaze had gone to the wings where the dust still swam in the wake of the fugitive and the pursuing boots. "You will remain exactly where you are, Mr. Hargreaves," Holmes said without raising his voice. "Doctor, attend Miss Vance. I will borrow, for 5 minutes only, the legs Providence has lent me." He was away then with that peculiar speed of his that seems less a matter of exertion than of finding the line of least resistance. I got Miss Vance seated, and seeing that her colour held and her breath was steady, I followed after at a pace consistent with my years and training. The side stair dropped to a narrow passage of raw boards and salt-rotten hemp. Beyond lay the scene dock, a cavern of flats, sky-cloths and rope coils that smelled of damp canvas and old thunder. Somewhere below a door banged, and the faint, ugly cough of a small engine answered. At St. James's the winches were worked by hand, but the delivery yard had a hired cart fitted with a petroleum motor that any boy would come to see. Holmes did not take the stairs. He went over the rail like a man taking a low hedge, caught a stay, and swung to the dock floor as lightly as a spider. I went after more soberly, and met Lestrade at a run from the far end, hat jammed, stick out. The lean man had chosen the door that opened upon the yard. For an instant I thought he had vanished into the street. Then the motor cart coughed again, and a figure shot from behind a stack of trestles and onto the low bed at the rear. The boy at the tiller yelped. The fellow struck him with the flat of the hand and flung him aside. The cart slewed, snatched, and rattled forward. Holmes had snatched up a length of line as another might take a walking stick. With a motion of the wrist that would have done credit to a sailor, he cast it. The loop fell neatly over the cart's rear stake. He did not hold it. He ran with the rope paid out from his hands until it came up against a bollard set for heavy scenery. He cast a turn, another, and let the friction do the labour-men call strength. The vehicle checked like an animal finding the end of its tether. The fugitive, unseated by the jerk, went to his knees. At the same instant, a constable reached the side and bore him down. It was as neat a capture as I have witnessed. Yet neatness has its price. The man fought like a machine whose governor has been knocked. No noise, only a focused violence, hands darting for eyes and throat with appalling economy. He had a short blade somewhere. I glimpsed the flash and moved without thought. The cut took my sleeve and scored my forearm. Before he could strike again, Lestrade's stick came down with the judiciousness of experience upon the wrist. The blade flew, bounced, and vanished into the straw-churned slush of the yard. "Enough," Holmes said coldly, and there was something in his tone that would have persuaded a mad dog. The fellow froze by inches. A pair of cuffs bit his blackened fingers. 2 more men arrived to lend their weight. The boy whimpered that his father would thrash him for the state of the cart. I bound my arm with a strip of handkerchief and felt the old steadiness return. The prisoner lifted his head then and looked at Holmes with a slow, measuring hatred. I saw the stain along the web of his thumb, now gone to a deep violet. He had good bones under the sallow, a nose with a soldier's pride, and eyes that moved with the quickness of an accountant's. When he spoke, the consonants were built like furniture. "You have touched what you do not understand," he said. "In my country, gentlemen do not wipe other men's hands." "In your country," Holmes returned, "gentlemen sometimes give themselves bird names when they prefer the company of shadows. In mine, we wipe what we please." Lestrade had the man up, and between 2 constables before the argument could season. "You'll like our yard," he observed with unearned geniality. "It has fewer corridors than this barn, and better locks." Holmes laid a finger upon the prisoner's overcoat pocket. "The silver." Lestrade nodded to a man who turned the pocket inside out. The mute slid into his palm with a guilty little chime against a coin. The inspector's smile grew funereal. "And there we are. Now tell me you only wish to polish it." The fellow shut his mouth as if he could turn the key in it. If he hoped for succour from Hargreaves, he hoped idly. The impresario, hovering at the dock's threshold, with an air of brave concern, had composed his face into the bland sorrow of one whose duty is to sigh and deplore. "Take him," Holmes said, "but not the mute. That will keep a better tongue here." When we regained the hall, Miss Vance was on her feet with a composure I admired the more for the tremor it hid. Hargreaves had resumed his public station near the chairman, offering the support of a man born to support those who clung to him. It was an admirable performance. Holmes allowed his eye to rest upon it as a critic rests his pen before he writes fair. Then he went to the side table, replaced the silver impostor in its velvet bed, and lifted Orlov's violin with a care that had nothing theatrical in it. "We have a few bars to rehearse yet," he said, in a voice that carried no farther than the circle of us whom the matter concerned. "Mr. Hargreaves, you will oblige me by a little truth. The man you have consulted for amusements, the club that trades in mutes and mixtures, goes by what name?" Hargreaves' demeanour did not alter. He put his head a fraction to one side, as if the angle might improve his hearing and therefore his morality. "Mr. Holmes," he said mellifluously, "I have consulted only men who love art. I do not know the names of all who admire it." "Then you shall know," Holmes replied, "for you cannot live long without the vocabulary of your deeds. The Schwalbe Club on St. John Street, the Swallow to those who are not asked to join, meets in the upper room of a public house and pays its rent by selling what honest chemists would not bottle. Its members are musicians and the parasites of musicians. Your friend downstairs, pray be easy. We have catalogued his teeth as well as his hands. Is one Weiss, later Vienna, formerly clockmaker's apprentice, latterly purveyor of mechanical conveniences to men who prefer their applause unshared. Weiss received money in your handwriting through a gentleman named Cohn in Hatton Garden 3 weeks since for metal work and counsel. He brought you the silver, and you brought him a haul that could be made into a box." The colour came and went in Hargreaves's cheeks like a badly handled lantern. "If you can prove any of that," he said at last, You will prove more than the Yard has proved in a year." "Patience," Holmes returned. "We are rehearsing. The proof enters later with the oboes." A commotion at the aisle spared Hargreaves another sentence. Lestrade had returned to report. "Name of Franz Weiss," he said briskly, consulting a slip. "Foreign Association card in his pocket, a swallow cut upon it. The silver is here. I have a man to fetch the watchmaker to identify his patron, if the infirmary will lend him for an hour." "Excellent," Holmes said. "And Mr. Ward?" Ward, who had been standing stiff as a post near the second desks, jerked as though pricked. He had watched the chase with a face that struggled between relief and some unwilling loyalty. Now he stepped forward, his jaw set. "I've had enough of this," he said roughly. "You will make a scandal so large that no decent player will get a month's hire in this town. If Orlov was caught in some foreign folly, why must we all hang for it?" Holmes regarded him oddly, gently. "No one need hang who has not plaited his own rope," he said, "but men do not contrive murder upon an acquaintance with a fortnight's standing. Herr Weiss knew too much of Orlov's tempers. He knew that vanity which keeps a man polishing wood when other men drink. He knew that flattery would send a valet for silk, and that a stage door can be bought for half a sovereign. Who taught him those top notes, Mr. Ward? Not a watchmaker." The second violin's mouth worked. A sound came that was not a word, and then was. "I told him," he said. "I told him Orlov had a trick with a handkerchief and a disdain for common rosin," as he sneered at it. "I told him when the man took his smoke. I told him, and if that makes me a murderer, you may say so and be damned." "It makes you a man used by cleverer men," Holmes returned, and there was no contempt in it. "Did Hargreaves bring you to Weiss?" Ward glanced at the impresario, and then away with the mechanical obedience of a long-paid creature. "He said a gentleman might assist me in obtaining a better place. He laughed at the foreigner after, called him a fiddler's tinker. I thought—" He broke off, ears reddening with the shame of a man who finds he has believed a lie about his own pride. Hargreaves shifted his ground to indignation. "This is monstrous," he cried. "An impresario must speak with tradesmen for the sake of his company. Am I to be arraigned for a kindness to a surly player and a fool of a jeweller?" "You are to be arraigned," Holmes said without heat, "for furnishing rooms, occasion, and excuses to a club that sells contrivances by which one artist may rid himself of another. You are to be arraigned for whispering to a valet that varnish is precious, for laying a cloth before a chair, and for recoiling very prettily from a silver trinket when you saw that the audience might not approve a demonstration. If your conscience requires something to hold, you may add that you sent a bottle of camphorated chloroform toward a woman who had the misfortune to smell your polish." His finger touched and lifted, the mute now seated safely upon plaster. He balanced it upon his nail. The silver glimmered like a tame moon. "We have nearly reached the cadence," he said. "One bar remains, the bar in which a letter is read and a ring is claimed. Lestrade, when Mr. Blaine is strong enough to sit, bring him to the hall and let him make for us a quiet bow. He will tell us whether Weiss asked him to treat the silver with a certain varnish, and whether he warned him that a shop may fall silent forever. Mr. Ward will tell us which Englishman made the introduction, and he will remind himself that envy is not murder until it accepts a commission. Miss Vance will stand with the living because she tried to keep a man from dying and was struck for it with a bruise. And Mr. Hargreaves—" He looked at the impresario as a surgeon looks at a growth already marked in the mind for removal. "Mr. Hargreaves will keep his right hand very still, for the stain argues conversation with the wrong companions. He set the violin back into its case with reverence and closed the lid. The rehearsal, which had frozen as if a spell lay on it, found its noise again, the scrape of chairs, the small coughs men use to return to themselves. But I, who have seen Holmes at a great many theatres of one sort and another, felt that we had left rehearsal behind. The last act was set. One had only to draw the curtain and let cause and effect play their appointed music. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a series of short strokes, each, as Holmes said, no louder than a metronome, but together enough to beat a man to time. Our first call was upon Mr. Cone in Hatton Garden. The jeweller received us in his tidy inner room, produced his ledger without rhetoric, and turned the leaves with a nail that might have been fashioned for accuracy. Holmes did not prompt him. He merely watched. "There," Cone said at last, tapping a line in a neat clerk's hand. "For metalwork and counsel, 3 guineas on account, balance £1 11 6, paid by Mr. Edmund Hargreaves in a sealed cover. Date, the 23rd ultimo." "Do you retain the covers?" Holmes asked, too courteous to call them envelopes. "For receipts of a certain delicacy, yes," Cone replied, slipping a paper from a drawer. It was a common cover, but upon the back someone had pressed a seal, an oval with a bird bearing a sprig in its beak. The impression was as like to the wax upon our latch plate as a man is like his shadow. "May I?" Holmes said. Cone bowed. Holmes compared the chamfer with our mould, smiled his thin smile, and restored both papers. "Our thanks," he said. "You will be so obliging, if called, as to state that your eyes are as good by gaslight as they are in the sun." Cone inclined his head. "For an honest cause I will name the cut and the hand that made it." We went next to the infirmary. Blaine, propped upon pillows, received us with the shy dignity of old craftsmen who have faced poverty and never made it vulgar. He identified vice without falter: the knuckle, the way he held a tool, the smell of camphor, and added, with a tremulous indignation that did him credit, that he would tell any magistrate that the gentleman warned me not to test the stuff, for it would silence the shop. Holmes had him rest, and promised that the only test made would be upon daylight and conscience. By 4 the fog drew a little aside, and the lamps along the Strand lit like a row of buttons fastened by an invisible hand. Holmes, who had been moving with that still haste of his, turned homeward and sat me down to tea as if I were a patient in need of comfort rather than a comrade in a chase. Only when the cups were cleared did he speak fully. "We have, you observe, a chain with 4 principal links," he said. "The club that supplies the chemistry, the watchmaker who supplies the silver, the impresario who supplies stage and opportunity, and the instrument, vanity, without which all the rest would be so much metal and breath. The second link has confessed, the first can be visited, the fourth is in the grave. It remains to make the third sing in key." "How?" I asked. "By offering him the exact note he has trained himself never to resist privacy. Men who live by applause will risk anything for a conversation without witnesses." He sent Billy with 2 notes. The first, signed with Weiss's name by permission of the Yard, was addressed to the Schwalbe Upper Room, St. John Street. A request that the gentleman who paid for counsel attend at 9 to arrange the remainder and recover the spare. The second, in Holmes's hand and to Lestrade, asked that the inspector permit a bird to fly into a properly prepared room. He then brought out the folded slip he had taken at Orlov's lodgings on our first night. "I did not read this before," he said, "because the act of reading produces a face I prefer not to show when company is coarse." He opened it now. It was a brief, acid memorandum in Hargreaves' own hand. Holmes knew it from concert bills, promising Orlov an additional fee upon delivery of an exclusive effect for Thursday, white tone preferred, and ending with a line that made my gorge rise. If Mr. Ward is displeased, he may take the chair when you tire. Here, Holmes said, is envy employed, not born. Hargreaves did not desire Ward's advancement because he loved him. He desired it because he could purchase it. Orlov was expensive. Ward was obedient. The arithmetic is not art, but it pays for Polish. At 8, we took a cab north. The house on St. John Street was one of those that were a public house below and a dozen little secrets above. The signboard showed a swallow cut in black against pale paint. A barman who had seen everything saw us and saw nothing. We went up by a back stair that smelt of stale tobacco and not new varnish. In the upper room, a scatter of chairs, a trestle, and a piano that had known better fingers waited beneath a smoky lamp. Holmes chose the seat farthest from the door and stood with his back to the wall. He wore the drab of his earlier disguise, and his face had taken on that nondescript pallor that makes men forget they have seen him. We had not long to wait. The first arrival was a thin fellow with a fiddler's chin who glanced at us, found nothing to interest him, and took a corner like a man who sits always in corners. 2 more came, both with the faint, foreign neatness that is to Londoners as a challenge or a compliment according to their temper. At 9 to the minute Hargreaves entered, his hat in his hand, his smile lacquered but cracking at the corners. "Gentlemen," he murmured, "I come as a patron of art. I know nothing of your club." He meant the room to laugh. It did not. The swallow on the wall above the piano made its own ungenerous comment. A 4th man slid in after him and shut the door. To my surprise, it was Ward, his face rigid, eyes fixed straight ahead, as if at a conductor who had lost the beat. Hargreaves checked. The smallest, swiftest glance, anger tempered by warning, passed between them. Holmes did not alter by a finger's breadth. "Mr. Weiss," Hargreaves said to the room at large, "if you have something belonging to this company, I am prepared to purchase its silence." A man by the piano, the thin fellow, lifted a hand. "Weiss is with the police," he said in German. "You pay the wrong wall." Hargreaves's smile died altogether. He turned towards the door. Holmes, who had not moved, spoke in a voice so quiet it was almost tender. "Going so soon, Mr. Hargreaves? The remainder of your account awaits you. Metal work and counsel, balance £1, 11 6. Mr. Cone would be grieved to think you had neglected your debts." The impresario stood very still. It is a melancholy sight to see courage, that has never before been asked, for attempt to grow in a man all at once. He made an effort to recover his manner. He failed. "This is a vulgar trap," he said. "If you imagine I carry contracts in my pocket, you mistake me." "I imagine," Holmes returned, "that you carry a ring upon your finger. The table by the wardrobe door remembers it." He let that rest a moment, then added, almost idly, "And perhaps a small bottle that has left a sweet ghost in the lining of your coat." Hargreaves's hand flicked, no more than a flutter towards the inner breast, checked at once. The thin man at the piano saw it. The room saw it. The swallow looked down. Ward took one step back, as if the floor had moved under him. Hargreaves' colour had gone from lantern to tallow. "If you are innocent," Holmes said gently, "you will be grateful to me tomorrow morning when the papers read attempted extortion at a London club instead of impresario in the dock. Sit, Mr. Hargreaves. We are rehearsing the truth." There are moments when the will of one man fills a room as a tuning note fills a hall. Hargreaves sat. The thin fellow laughed once without sound. Holmes inclined his head to him. "Sir," he said in German of a purity I had not heard from him since a case in the Rue Auber, "you will save your club a search if you will tell us which drawer holds the book of subscriptions and which holds the list of commissions. We require only 2 names." The man shrugged and indicated a small chest beneath the trestle. Holmes drew it out, turned the key that lay upon it, and opened the top drawer. Upon a lined page, in a clerk's careful hand, stood entries of petty sums against initials and symbols, a lyre, a metronome, a harp, and, 3 weeks back, a little bird, scratched as if by a man who did not belong to such an alphabet, and the letters E.H. opposite. Beneath, in a second hand, a note, "Paid, cone, for the white effect." Hargreaves released his breath, audibly. It is curious, but there are men who surrender, not when they are cornered, but when they see how commonplace their trap has been. "You will twist this," he said without heat, as if to himself. "You will call it murder. It was business, a novelty. I did not know." "Say it smoothly," Holmes advised, "and you may yet believe it. But you knew enough to warn a valet about varnish, to urge a cloth and a polished stage, to send camphor where almonds might betray you. You knew enough to withdraw your hand at the last moment before a public experiment. You knew enough to pay the man who knew the rest." Ward spoke then, and I was more sorry for him than angry. "I did not know he would die," he said. "I thought the foreigner said it would stun, make him gasp, teach him a lesson. I thought I might take first desk for a week and show I was not a tradesman. God forgive me." Holmes looked at him with an expression I have only seen him give to souls he has decided not to break. "You will tell that to a magistrate," he said. "It may not save you, but it will set your jaw in the right place when you speak." A sound came at the stair then, the particular footfall of official boots that have learned to enter a room as if it were already theirs. Lestrade, never theatrical when he could be practical, stepped in with 2 men and a nod to Holmes. The inspector's glance took in the open drawer, the ledger, the ring that now lay very plainly upon Hargreaves' right hand, and the general odour of a secret thoroughly aired. "Shall I strike up the band?" he inquired, by which he meant, "Shall I act?" "Not yet," Holmes said. "One more bar, if you please." He turned to Hargreaves. "You will come to the hall at 10 tomorrow, and take your accustomed place before those who loved Mr. Orlov's art. You will hear a short demonstration. You will not try the doors. If you fail in any of these things, the paper in my pocket will go to the Morning Post with names sufficient to send your club's birds into exile by midday. If you attend, I will see that envy stands where it belongs, behind the dock, not under it." Hargreaves looked at him with a gratitude that would have been moving in a better man. "You are very merciful," he said. "Do not mistake frugality for mercy," Holmes returned. "I dislike waste. The yard shall have you when the house is full, not before." We left them to Lestrade's plain arrangements. On the pavement, Holmes drew his coat close and breathed once, as if rinsing his lungs. "Tomorrow," he said, and the old iron entered his voice. "We show London how a whisper kills and who first taught it to speak. After that, we shall let the applause go where it belongs." "And where is that?" I asked. "To a dead man," he answered, "and to a woman who wrote a warning in a room where she had no right to be, and to a valet who kept a cloth that was clean." We took the long way home, for Holmes has a superstition about going straight to Baker Street with a case still breathing. The fog had come down again, a soft curtain drawing the streets into a theatre meant for 2. He walked with his chin sunk, counting some silent measure. Only once did he speak before the door closed behind us. "Set your nerves, Watson," he said. "In the morning, There will be gaslight, curious faces, and men who find their courage in a crowd. We must move as one moves in surgery, without haste, without anger, and without the smallest tremor. I shall make him conduct his own arrest. Morning brought one of those cold, brittle suns that London wears like a borrowed jewel. It shines, but the warmth belongs elsewhere. Holmes broke his fast with unusual thoroughness, then smoked 2 pipes in silence and rose only when the clock on our mantel chimed the 10:15. He looked, I thought, like a surgeon who has counted his instruments and found none missing. St. James's Hall was already half full when we entered by the side. The committee, eager for order and ink, had admitted a handful of patrons, a pressman or two, whose noses had found the scent, and a curious scatter of players not called to rehearse but drawn by rumour. At the front, Lestrade sat with an implacable calm which, in policemen, is the professional form of anticipation. Miss Vance had placed herself in the first row beside 2 elderly ladies whose knitting would, I think, have continued under cannon. Mr. Ward stood in the pit with the posture of a man who has decided to be brave and expects to be punished for it. Hargreaves, beautifully shaved and studied to a hair, took the aisle with the authority of one who belongs to aisles. He made for the rostrum. Holmes intercepted him with a bow that would have satisfied a court. "Mr. Hargreaves will, I trust, indulge me for 10 minutes in the interests of his own dignity," he said, his voice pitched to carry and yet not jar. "We meet to honour Mr. Orlov. It is fitting that we first remove the odour of superstition from his art and put in its place the odour of fact. Inspector, the articles?" Lestrade nodded, and a constable brought forward a tray upon which lay 2 objects upon separate squares of velvet, a silver mute that gleamed with innocent malice, and a small bell jar with a strip of yellow paper clipped beneath its mouth. Beside them rested a fragment of bow hair and a sliver of violin string. The audience made that small, unanimous sound by which a crowd agrees it has been properly invited to participate. Holmes lifted the bell jar. "You will forgive the apparatus. I have no desire to repeat last night's calamity upon living lungs. The yellow paper is treated with a compound which, in the presence of hydrocyanic vapour, the bitter almond of the novelists, takes on an unmistakable reddish brown. The fragment of hair and the string are harmless until warmed. The mute, in its original state, would have provided the warmth's excuse. Our silver here," he touched the safer twin with a fingernail, "is lined with an absorbent. It cannot harm a gnat. The other, the one recovered from a certain gentleman's pocket an hour after he visited our side table, has already been handled by the yard, and is not fit for public use. We will content ourselves with the chemical ghost it leaves." He placed the bow hair and a thread of string beneath the jar, with a droplet from a phial. A spirit lamp kissed the glass from a respectful distance. For a moment there was nothing. Then the strip of paper, which had lain pale as a winter reed, took on, from its centre outward, a flush like old blood. The change quickened. A breath rose in the assembly and died away into that hush which has weight. Miss Vance's gloved hands closed once upon each other and did not again move. "Thank you," Holmes said gently, as if the paper had done him a politeness. He turned to Cone, the jeweller, who had taken a seat at Lestrade's left. "Mr. Cone, will you tell these gentlemen whether the impression upon this cover," he held up the envelope from Hatton Garden, "is of a ring you have seen since?" Cone's neat voice carried like a well-cut facet. "It is the same oval, the same chamfer at the base, the same bird with sprig. I saw it this morning upon Mr. Hargreaves's hand." Holmes allowed his gaze to travel, slowly, almost lazily, to the ring that glittered upon the impresario's right. Hargreaves coloured, then paled, then smiled with great self-command, as a man smiles when his tongue tastes iron. "Trifles," he said smoothly. "I have set my seal to many charities." "To this at least," Holmes returned. "Mr. Blaine." The old watchmaker came forward under escort, greyer by a night and steadier for it. He touched the rail of the pit as a man touches a church rail and spoke with a craftsman's economy. The foreign gentleman brought the silver and the instructions. The varnish was his. He told me, "Do not test, or your shop will fall silent." The impresario paid me through Mr. Cone for the work and counsel. A ripple went through the hall, a rustle like leaves under a foot one cannot at once see. Hargreaves' lips parted upon rhetoric. Holmes did not give him air. "Mr. Ward," he said, and I confess I admired the steadiness with which the second violin stepped into the light. "You will say what you told us in the upper room last evening." Ward swallowed. His eyes were on the floor. His voice was harsher than I had heard it. "I complained of Orloff. I told a foreigner, Weiss, when he polished, what he scorned, and when he smoked. Mr. Hargreaves introduced us. He spoke of a white effect and a novelty. I thought it a lesson. I did not think death. I was a fool." Holmes inclined his head. "You will tell a magistrate the same. He may remember your ignorance. The law will remember your envy. Now—" He faced Hargreaves at last, and the warmth went out of his tone as a flame goes out when a glass falls over it. "You sent Miss Vance to a private rehearsal that did not exist. You whispered to a valet that his master's varnish was precious. You bought the latch of a door for half a sovereign. You carried chloroform with camphor to flatter your conscience. You withdrew your hand from a demonstration when you feared the crowd would witness your courage, and you sealed your payments to a club that sells silence. You will now earn for once an honest fee you will conduct." A murmur rose and broke. Hargreaves stared, astonishment making his face briefly naked. "Conduct? What jest—" "The last bars," Holmes said. He set Orloff's violin upon its chair and, with a precision that I think wounded him, placed upon the bridge the harmless silver twin. "You will perform your intended vindication, but upon this mute. The yard will keep the other for a court. You will also tell these people whether you intended last night to fit the true silver to this instrument in public, and why at the last your fingers lost their bravery." Hargreaves's eyes flickered to the pressman. A lesser man would have refused. He had been too long worshipped to choose refusal before witnesses. He took up the bow. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, with his old mellifluousness, and I saw admiration like a reflex move across a face or two, "you have heard fables. Observe." He played 4 bars, quiet, shamelessly beautiful, a whisper, without hazard. "A mute," he said lightly, "is a mute. We have been misled." "Instructively," Holmes answered, and his hand, which had strayed near the bell jar, now held up the stained strip for all to see. "By chemistry and by money." Lestrade rose with the patience of a man who has been fed his cue. "Edmund Hargreaves," he said, in a voice which, for all its official timbre, had humanity in it, "I arrest you on suspicion of conspiracy to murder Nikolai Orloff, together with Franz Weiss, now in custody, and such others as may be named. You will come quietly." For a heartbeat I thought the impresario would attempt some last flourish. The muscles along his jaw fluttered once, twice. Then the habit of calculation returned and settled upon him like grease upon water. He set down the bow. "You will regret this, Inspector," he said, not to Lestrade, but to the room, to London, to his own legend. "You will find a jury, perhaps. You will not find an audience." "You have one now," Holmes observed, "and it is not applauding." There was a rustle as 2 constables moved. Hargreaves half turned, to me, to Miss Vance, to the world he had flattered, and in that instant the smoothness left him. "It was business," he said, and I have seldom heard 3 words more pitiful. "Business." "Art pays its bills," Holmes returned, "but it does not kill its creditors." They led him away. The sound that followed was not applause. It was the collective exhalation of a hall that has understood too late that its pleasures may be instruments. Holmes, who dislikes being present when the moral is, distributed, lifted the bell jar, quenched the lamp, and pocketed the stained paper as one might pocket a warrant. He turned to Miss Vance and, in a tone that would not have disordered a child's hair, said, "You will sing on Saturday, as you meant to sing. London will be improved by the exercise." She tried to thank him. He spared her. To Ward he said only, "Stand where you stood and play as you can. When envy rises, remember that it took a watchmaker to make it useful." We were in the corridor before the chatter properly began. Holmes's face, which had been cut from ice, softened by degrees until it was again the face of my friend. "Come, Watson," he said. "There is a bowl of Mrs. Hudson's broth that will do more for the world than any number of memorials." "You will be called to the inquest," I reminded him. "In due time," he nodded. "We have reached the end of a movement. The coda can be entrusted to men who wear wigs." As we stepped into the thin noon, he paused and looked back once at the doors, where people already clustered to discuss motive and mutes, as if they had known them all their lives. "A whisper, my dear fellow," he said. "It killed a man and saved 3 souls. It is a dangerous register." "And you?" I asked. "What register do you prefer?" He smiled, the small, rare smile that makes his hawk's face for a moment human. "Silence," he said. "It carries better." The afternoon following the arrest dawned with a curious calm over Baker Street, as though the very air had been cleared by Holmes's orchestration of justice. The papers arrived in a flurry, the Times, the Telegraph, the Pall Mall Gazette, each carrying its column of astonishment. "A devilish device at St. James's Hall," said one. "Murder by music," cried another. Holmes glanced at the headlines, smiled with faint amusement, and cast them aside. He had already read the only version that mattered, the one written upon the conscience of those who remained alive. By noon, Lestrade himself called to make his report. Weiss had confessed in part. A man of means and music had come to him through the Schwalbe Club, bearing a commission and a promise of profit. He had treated the silver mute with a varnish derived from cyanide of mercury, chosen for its volatility and silence. Orlov's own breath and bow would summon the poison from its prison, and the whisper that enchanted London would be the same whisper that stole his life. The chemical proofs, Holmes said, were as tidy as any he had seen. "Your case will stand," Lestrade concluded, tapping his notebook with satisfaction. "Weiss will hang, and Hargreaves will follow him, though he'll call it art to the end. As for the club, it's being dismantled even as we speak. I've a dozen men sniffing through its feathers." Holmes nodded without triumph. "A foul nest, Inspector. Still, I suspect the birds will settle elsewhere. Vanity and greed are not so easily caged." When Lestrade had gone, silence returned, save for the ticking of the clock and the soft scrape of Holmes's bow across the strings of his own violin. The melody was low and reflective, no triumph, no grandeur, only a private elegy. I had heard him play Bach to clarify thought, Paganini to ridicule mediocrity, but this was neither. It was something of his own, a tone of compassion so quiet that it seemed to apologize for existing at all. "You see, Watson," he said at length, lowering the instrument, "there are 2 kinds of music in the world. The first lifts a man above himself. The second drags him deeper into the vanity of his own sound. Orloff loved the former, but he was slain by the latter. Hargreaves turned harmony into commerce, and commerce, once mixed with envy, breeds death. I watched him refill his pipe and considered his words. And yet, I said, it was your own orchestration that exposed them all. You conducted the finale as precisely as he would have done his concert. Holmes's eyes glimmered through the smoke. An apt metaphor, my dear fellow, though I prefer to think of myself as the listener rather than the conductor. The music was already written. I merely turned the page at the right moment. He rose, pacing before the window, where the London fog had begun to creep once more along the glass. There is a curious symmetry in this affair. A man dies for art, a woman lives for it, and another learns that fame cannot be tuned without cost. I confess, it touches even my professional indifference. Miss Vance has already written to express her gratitude, though I fear the concert she will give on Saturday will be half elegy, half expiation. She owes you her piece, I said. Holmes waved the thought away. Peace, Watson, is never owed. It must be earned, and Miss Vance has done so. She tried to prevent what the others pursued. The same cannot be said of Hargreaves. He will hang in the name of business, as he called it, and the public will go on applauding the next impresario who flatters its vanity. London does not change. It merely alters its tempo. The fire cracked, scattering a few sparks. Outside, a lamp-lighter's pole tapped against the glass, its glow faint in the thickening fog. Holmes resumed his seat, folding his long fingers beneath his chin, the faint smile returning to his face. I suppose, I ventured, that the motive, after all, was envy, the oldest of poisons. Not envy alone, he said. Ambition, greed, the artist's conceit, the businessman's delusion that beauty can be bought. The chemistry of the crime was merely its echo. The true poison lay in the mind before it ever touched the silver. He leaned back, his gaze wandering to the ceiling as if tracing invisible music there. And yet, one must admire the artistry of the instrument itself. Ingenious in its construction, diabolical in its effect. A whisper that kills, Watson. There is poetry even in that. I find no poetry in murder, I replied sharply. He looked at me then, the keen amusement in his eyes tempered by something like melancholy. Nor I, but one must recognize design even when it serves darkness. Remember, it is the same hand that shapes both melody and silence. For a long while we said nothing more. The fog thickened until the city vanished beyond our window, and the lamplight glowed like a single ember in a world gone dim. Then Holmes, with sudden energy, reached for his violin again, and drew from it a phrase so soft and pure that it seemed a benediction upon the dead. It rose, quivered, and died upon the air, like the final breath of the murdered maestro. He set the instrument down with care and reached for his pipe. "There, Watson," he said, "let that be Orlov's true requiem, unwritten, unbought, and unpoisoned." "And what of you?" I asked quietly. "Does the case not trouble you, the cunning, the cruelty of it?" He smiled faintly, as if amused by my persistence. "Every case troubles me, my dear Watson. It is why I take them. The world plays in 1,000 keys, and most men hear only one. My task is to discern the dissonance. Once done, I can let the tune end." He rose and drew the curtains shut, muting the city's restless murmur. "Come, Watson. The day has earned a supper. Mrs. Hudson's broth awaits, and I believe I have earned a brief retreat into the lesser mysteries of tobacco." As he passed into the adjoining room, I lingered a moment longer, looking at the violin on the chair and the faint curl of smoke that drifted from the dying fire. Somewhere in London the newsboys were crying their headlines of murder and genius, art and greed, while the evening carriages rolled on as though no man had ever died for music. But in that quiet room at Baker Street, I felt something altogether different, a sense that the great detective, for all his logic and restraint, had allowed one note of compassion to enter his symphony of reason. It hung there still, like the last echo of a melody not meant for the world to hear, and so ended the case of the violin that whispered death, not with a cry, but with a silence more eloquent than any applause.